Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we sail north into the frozen unknown to join the ranks of the 19th century polar explorers. Imagine the creak of wooden ships trapped in ice, the sting of wind on your face, and the endless white stretching to the horizon. Adventure promised glory, but the reality was hunger, frostbite, and the fear that rescue might never come. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you, as a fellow knight of these tales, to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what other period of history you would like to experience. Now, wrap your furs tight, the polar night awaits. Chapter 1. Departure from the Thames. Our story begins in Deptford Dockyard. Imagine you are an able seaman on HMS Erebus in the year 1845. Bunting hangs from the yard arms, the slop chests are being tallied, and the smell of tar hangs in the air. Soon the pack will close and duty will demand long sledging and the risk of hunger, and hard miles will be measured by hauling and faith. But for now the boats lay ready and orders were simple. The gangway was kept clear, the quarterdeck tidy, and the men waited where they were told. A list was read and the names answered, and every bag sat tight at the foot of its owner. The purser's lads went past with pencils behind their ears, and the steward made his counts again, sure and calm. A pair of dockyard hands finished chalking marks on a crate of flour and stood aside so the checker could see. The master and the pilot settled small points at the rail with quick words and a finger set on a page. A minute later, the hands posted a notice at the main hatch to show how the watch would be told off for the first night underway. Nothing in it surprised anyone who had sailed before, and nothing in it was meant to please or nettle. It was only the plain plan for a plain start, which was how proper voyages were begun. London lay just out of sight beyond the sheds and masts, and the river went about its steady business, as if no ship had ever made a fuss about leaving. In the morning, watch the lines of order had to be drawn again, and so the ship was arranged by habit that had been learned. Division officers checked hammocks and mess kits, and the sick list was taken with plain care. Pay tickets were folded away, and a man who owed for clothes promised a shilling when the next advance came. A petty officer stood by the ladder and chose hands for small errands, each task matching a name he trusted. The thin whistle of the boatswain's call cut across the deck and set feet in motion. He drew a line with his thumbnail through a pair of crossed-out entries and pushed the ledger back to the boy who carried it. The same boy stood straighter when the officer thanked him by name, because small courtesies mattered in a crowd where rank decided most things. Over by the long ladder to the lower deck, a mess leader bargained for a better place to stow his kettle and won it after a brief exchange that left both men satisfied. Another came up from below with a coil that needed somewhere to live. He placed it where it would not block a path in the dark and tied it off without fuss. Across the deck, someone asked after a mate who had not yet shown his face, and a reply came that he had been sent with a party to check the bread rooms. By and by there was nothing left to move except men, and even they felt part of a list that could be ticked and trusted. A good ship began as a tidy ledger and a busy deck, and both were in hand. Down along the quay, there had been faces looking up from time to time, as wives or sweethearts tried to hold a last moment without drawing notice. A nod passed from the ship to the shore and back again, brief and firm, and nothing else was needed. A sergeant from the guard kept an eye on order where the gangway met the planks, and he had no wish to make a show of it. A clerk from the yard came with a voucher that required a signature, and the captain's clerk took it and put it away. Lighters with casks moved about their business, and the last of the small stores were taken in with care. The grit of coal dust on palms marked those who had helped heave the sack that split near the hatch. A lad rubbed his hands on his trousers and smiled at the man who had steadied him while the weight threatened to swing. A child on the quay took a step forward and was drawn back by a gentle hand, and then all such thoughts were folded away behind plain faces. Some men kept their backs to the rail, not from coldness but because habit told them to hold their ground where they were useful. Others watched the purser's window for a sign that a small matter had been cleared, and when it had, they moved on without comment. Each of these things was little, but together they made the start seem solid rather than hurried, and it gave shape to the thought that the day could be carried without waste. That kind of order felt like a railing to catch, steady and near. Stories about the ice had lived in messes long before any pack showed itself. Old hands told of a place where the sun lingered and compasses played tricks, and the green ones nodded and kept their thoughts. Those tales were shaped to pass an hour, and to make a man feel part of something larger than his hammock. Yet they did not govern the day. The day belonged to the simple rules that kept a hull sound and a crew steady. Hands were to their stations, gear was kept dry and stowed, and each man knew who stood above him when a choice had to be made. The damp of the dock mist settled on cuffs and collars as if to pin everyone to the present. A man in the middle years who had seen far coasts spoke a few plain words to a younger messmate about keeping spare socks dry and never losing a spoon, and that advice was kept. The lieutenant's eye passed across those small exchanges and was pleased to find no swagger that might sour into trouble later. He paused by the water cask to ask after the supply and left with a short nod. When the captain withdrew, a second in command took 2 steps closer to where work was being done and made it known, without saying it, that the same calm standard would hold when the clocks changed and the land went away behind them. Somewhere beyond the yards time moved as it always moved, but on deck time was counted by lists and the steady walk of men at work. Work felt smaller when cut into pieces that fit a morning. Coils were paid out and taken in again so they would lie the right way, and small boats were checked for plugs and thwarts. The sailmaker's bench had a patch laid out for someone who knew how to follow a line, and the gunner's people kept their stores in order without making much to do. A mate came by with a list and ticked off each item as a glance made it right. The rough hemp against fingers made its own reminder that every knot had to be easy to cast off when the time came. A lad practiced a good loop until he could make it with his eyes on the officer and not on the rope, and an older hand watched without comment until it was done well. Men were set to scrub a section of plank and leave it ready for the next party who would need the space. The boats on the skids were given a final look so that no plug or pin would be wanting when the order came to swing them out. Sea chests were shifted a little this way or that, so they would not start when the ship took a new angle, and each move was chalked in the memory of the man who made it. Nothing clever was asked, only care and a steady pace. In work like that, the day found its shape, and there was comfort in shapes that could be learned and repeated. Toward the end of the day, the pace eased, and talk drifted to small comforts. Messmates found places along the tables, and tin plates were set out with the same patience as always. A man who had a knack with a needle mended a tear, and another sharpened a knife on a bit of stone kept for that purpose. The warmth from the galley stove pressed softly against faces when the hatch was opened. No one called it fine, but it was welcome in the way steady heat is welcome to men who have known damp. A scrap of news from ashore was repeated until it lost its shine, and then it was put aside like any other small treasure that has served its hour. A man who could write set down a few lines for home, to be sent from the next stop if he found a chance, and he folded the page with care before slipping it away. Someone else told a simple joke that had done duty on a dozen ships and earned the same small smile it always earned. Over and over the thought formed that a crew which could find ease together at the end of a long day could pull together when the world turned hard. It did not need saying. It lived in the way cups were shared and chores were split without fuss. It was the sort of end a ship liked, because it stored up quiet for when the next call would come. Later, when the deck lamps were tended and the bustle of the day had fallen away, a quieter piece of time arrived. In that pocket of ease, plans were weighed without boasting. A man counted his strengths and his weak points the way he might count coins, private and plain. A small prayer was shaped in the head by those who had the habit, and others set their minds by rule and simple goals. The dry crumble of a biscuit on the tongue had a way of making thoughts spare and honest. Promises made when signing on were thought of again, and they felt weighty enough to carry but not so heavy as to bend a back. The ice was still a word in a book, and the sledges were just timber on a list. But a day would come when they would be work under hands. That was not a thing to fear, only a thing to prepare for by keeping tools right and bodies ready. No one knew what names would be remembered and what names would be carried home and faded unnoticed, but the start was shared by all and shared evenly. In that sharing, there was a kind of peace that held fast for as long as the lamp burned. Sleep came because the body knew its work and claimed its due. At last the hour for leaving came round as a matter of seamanship and tide, not ceremony. Orders were passed with the same calm tone used for any corps, and men went to their places. The moorings were seen to, the last gear was lashed, and a final check rolled along the deck as if by its own hand. A pilot stood where he needed to stand and said what needed saying, and there was nothing grand about it. The low flap of canvas carried along the rigging told enough about the breeze to guide what came next. The anchor was brought to the attention it deserved, and the line of men made the work move as one. A glance toward the dock showed only the ordinary shore that had seen ships off before, and no one leaned on the rail for long. The river would take them out the way it had taken others, and the sea would receive them as it always had. In that steady turn from land to water, the start was made and set, and the next stretch waited with its own measures. Northward lay the open, and in the morning light to come the watches would be marked, and the ship would find its wind. What waited would be told by wind and plain duty. Chapter 2. Northward under sail. The forenoon watch had been yours, and it had been kept in the plain way of the service, with the ship lying close to the wind and the braces handled in sequence as orders came down the deck. Notes from the sextant had been taken and handed to the mate, who marked them in the book with steady care and no fuss at all. The numbers meant a position that the mind held like a shape in the head, a shape that moved with each trick at the helm and each call from the quarterdeck. Men stood by the sheets ready for the next change, and the ship's head answered in small obedient turns. Past and forward, the same tools served the same purpose, and there had been comfort in that sameness. A comrade beside had stood easy in the lee, eyes on the telltales and lips closed against loose talk. Erebus had worked north by east, and the sense of progress had been a quiet thing, unvoiced and plain. The shift of duties had been marked by the bosun's short word, and the logbook with its simple lines had held the day in ink that would dry and stay put. The one bright matter that cut through it all had been the snap of canvas at each ordered tack. When the islands rose, they did not rise with any noise, only with a steady promise that the track north lay sure beyond them. Charts had already shown what the eyes later confirmed, but the eyes still did the last proof of the way. An officer ahead had run his hand along the folded edge of the chart, and a quartermaster had stepped to repeat the course like a prayer learned well. It was not a place of drama, only a stage in the going on, and even the older hands treated it like any other headland left astern. Boats had been checked for stowage, lines made up, and the ship kept in neat trim for a clean run on the next stretch. Talk had been light and brief, save for names of home that visited a mouth and left it again. Nothing had been done for show, and no man said more than needed. In time, a dark, level rim had drawn straight along the water to the beam, and then slid away behind on the ship's slow turn, and the one clear thing given to memory had been the low, firm line of Orkney in sight. At the first chance below, the mess found its order without thinking. A bench, a tin, a ladle, a quick word over who sat where and who paid the last joke forward, and the business of eating went on as it always went on. There had been the simple tools of the table, and no one argued with a routine that filled a man and kept him to time. The body wanted fuel and the mind wanted something plain to fix on, so talk circled over bits of rumor and small boasts that could be forgiven, and then fell quiet when bread and meat met tin. One hand had passed the bread with a nod, and another had pushed the water jar to the middle and left it there, and that had been enough sharing for the hour. There was no claim of glory in such things, only the ordinary that once kept, allowed a ship to be a ship. The men had bitten down, and one thing that had lodged in the mouth had been the dry, chalky taste of hardtack. Work on deck between watches had not asked for thought, only care. Coils had been lifted and laid in neat rings, the kind that showed a man respected the next man's step. Blocks had been eyed for fair running, and the small fixes that kept a line from chafing had been done in their quiet place. The boards had wanted a bit of rubbing, and so the hands had taken to them, and the knees had found the spots they always found, and the time had passed, as time passed, when a crew kept a ship in hand. A comrade had spoken of home, another of the pay note due, and then the words had run thin because everyone knew the same bits already. There had been no need to make a speech about the pride of a well-kept deck. The proof sat right there in the way things lay. The plain, simple truth of the work had lived under the skin, and the one thing the skin had not forgotten had been the grit under the palms while holystoning. Afternoons at sea had made their own kind of society, one shaped by habit more than any plan. A man mended a shirt, another cut a scrap of wood into a toy for luck, and the older hand told a short, true story only once, because once had been enough. There had been moments when the mind wandered to the ice ahead, and then it came back to the present because the present always needed 2 hands and a straight back. Discipline and ease lived together without quarrel when a ship ran well. Rum had been measured as ordered, water had been counted as ordered, and no one forgot that the next day would look like this day if all went right. The officers had come and gone with light steps and steady faces, and the wheel had stayed with a man who knew how not to fuss. Friendships had shown themselves in the smallest things, a tool shared, a stitch tied for another. All the while, the one thing that marked the hour had been the faint, sweet smell of pipe smoke near the lee rail. Evening brought no change in the heart of the work, only a change of names on duty. Bearings had been checked again, numbers set down again, and a plan made again for the next tack. The ship did not hurry and did not lag, and in that steadiness there had been a kind of peace. The sea ahead meant cold and labor soon enough, and no man needed to say it aloud. The thinking settled itself in private corners of the head. A hand at the con had spoken low, and the lead man had repeated the order without a blink, and the helmsman had carried it out with the sort of care that never sought praise. Voices stayed short, because short words did the work better than long ones. The day's small triumph had been a neat log entry, a crisp course line, and a crew ready for the next call. When the sun went lower, the one thing that touched a man cleanly had been the sharp sting of the air on the knuckles. Myths about the north had sailed with the ship, but they had been dressed down by the tasks that filled the hours. Stories told ashore had carried giants and wonders, and yet the real thing lay in the checks and the steady rule of the watches. Hands knew the measure of the rope, the pace of the shift, the wait before a call, and that knowledge gave more comfort than any tale. A man trusted the habit of his mates, and he trusted the habit in himself, and the ship thanked them both by keeping true. The bosun had said little and watched much, and that had been enough to keep slackness from creeping in. The day moved forward the way a clean stitch line moved along the seam of a coat, sure and plain. With every change, 8 names went on, and 8 names came off, and there had been no loss in that swap. The one sound that settled the whole into one piece had been the thin, exact strike of the bell at 8 bells. By the time Orkney had been a memory rather than a sight, the way north had grown simple in the head. The course lay set, the minds lay set, and the days began to carry a kind of quiet pride, like a job that had been approached right and kept right. The old talk of difficulty gave way to the nearer matter of each next duty, and in that turn the crew learned how much strength lived in plain order. You had believed the north would be a single hard wall, and now it waited instead as a series of small steps, each walked in its moment. The officers kept counsel without fuss, the hands kept to their marks without argument, and the ship kept her promise with no flourish. A comrade at the rail named the next headland, and then fell quiet, and silence suited the thought of what lay beyond. The logbook pages filled, one after the other, without drama. Ahead, the one sight that held every look to the same place had been the pale band along the far horizon where the colder water began. Chapter 3. Into the pack. The day the pack closed around the ship had been expected since the latitude changed and the wind steadied, and still it arrived like a gate closing. Sails were snugged, yards struck a point lower, and the officers paced a shorter span, measuring the flow the way a farmer measures a hedge. Men turned to duties that had been practiced in warmer water, only now everything took longer, and each order reached farther than the last. The carpenter's crew readied spare spars, the bosun laid out heavier rope, and the master pointed to the nearest vein of loose pieces that might be cut into a lane. The ship waited while the flow pressed and released with simple purpose. Then the first pressure nursed itself along the planking, a slow message sent from beam to beam. It arrived without fuss and made its claim on the day. The deep, patient grind along the hull was the only sign needed to mark the start of the work and the end of the easy part. A hand nearby said it would be simple once a road was made. The watch changed in plain order, and the boats were served out for strange duty. Charts lay open in the cabin, and the officers weighed the miles of coal and biscuit against the season. The aim was plain enough: make a path, keep the ship whole, and take what the day allowed. The order went around for an ice party, and at once the ship divided itself the way a crew knows how when a job has many hands to it. At the rail the cutting gang collected tools, and a boat was eased down with a coil fit to run. At the word you joined them and stepped onto the floe behind a petty officer who knew where to test and where to trust. Short ladders and spare planks were set to make the first path, and then the real business began. An ice saw was given 2 men to a side, and a longer cut was marked to meet a second cut and free a panel. Another team hauled a kedge anchor on a sledge, its shank lashed and its flukes swaddled in canvas, bound for a stretch of free water where it could bite. Lines were paid out in neat flakes, and knots were tied with attention learned in calmer places. The plan was old and exact: open a lane, set the hook ahead, bring the hull forward a little, and repeat until the day ran out. The only thing that bit without waiting was the cold along the fingers, a thin reminder that mittens did not stop steel from stealing heat. Work went on in order, and no one asked for more than the next length to be cleared. Back on deck, the line ran fair from the bow to the drum, and the crew set their shoulders and found a common pace under the mate. The bow edged toward the lane that had been freed, and the floe, nicked and trimmed by the cutters, offered a place for the keel to pass. Poles with iron shoes were pushed out to steady the first movement, and the men in the boat kept the strain true and nodded when the anchor took its share. A comrade at the posts paid out or took in as told, and no one hurried the thing that could not be hurried. The lead took shape as a thin promise that widened into a ribbon only after stubborn minutes, and the ship obeyed that promise, inch by inch. Only one thing broke the sameness: a blue in the water where the fresh cut met the old flow, a color that meant depth where there had only been hardness before. That glimpse gave heart enough for another turn, and then another. The cutters stepped ahead to mark the next panel. The anchor team made ready to fetch the hook, and the day, which had begun clenched, uncurled a little. No one spoke of distance. It was always to the next mark and no farther. The pilotage was patience measured in feet. The engineers, who had kept their corner tidy for a moment like this, asked and received a brief leave to wake the small engine. Coal was brought sparingly and water checked, and soon the brass that had been polished for months met its work with quiet certainty. The screw would not make a race of it, but it could lift a stern away from a pinch and ease the ship along a turn when the line's pull alone made a bad angle. A signal was agreed between deck and below, and the officers waited until the anchor held fast enough to trust a nudge. Then the first turn was asked of the machinery, and the hull answered with a shift that pleased even the men who did not care for new things. What reached every nose in that moment was the plain proof of the trial: a breath of coal smoke that curled across the floe and reminded all hands that fuel had its own clock. It was not much, yet it freed the stern from a grip that might have wasted a whole hour. The engine was let rest at once, and the old way resumed. No one cheered. It was just another aid to the same stubborn plan, and it had to be used like coin from a small purse. A tangle rose in the hauling line partway through the next stretch, the kind of hitch that grows from haste and gloves and the need to do 3 things with 2 hands. The petty officer called for the slack to be nursed, and the men in the boat held the strain while the knot was worried out and the lay put right. It was a small business, yet it mattered. No one wanted the hook to slip or the ship to swing across the cut. You held a turn with your teeth to keep the bite from running back, while a comrade teased the crossing strands apart, and patience returned the rope to the shape it preferred. The taste that came with that trick was old and simple, a dry salt that had lived in hemp all its days and did not mind reminding a mouth where it came from. The hitch gave way, the order to heave was given again, and the bars went round. By and by, the ship's weight moved forward the span of another cable, and the line settled without mischief. The small delay had taught the obvious: no one makes time on ice, one only keeps it from slipping away. The men returned to their posts as if nothing had happened, and the next cut began where the last left off. Late in the watch, a ridge drifted across the planned lane, a piled bank that would have taken a day to cut by saw and chisel. The master weighed the hour, and the work left, and said a shorter road must be made. The gunner's mate fetched a small bag of powder from the chest, and the cutting gang worked 2 narrow slots into the mass and tamped snow as they had been shown weeks before. The boat eased off to a safe span on the line. The men on deck held their places, and the mate walked the length once to be sure no one stood where no one should. Fire was carried across in a sober hand, a touch was given to the train, and all turned away out of habit born of Gundeck days. The mark of the act came back at once as a dull thud that travelled through air and seemed to fold into the ice without brag. The ridge sagged, a seam opened, and the cutters went back in to break the loose chunks and let the boat clear them with a hook. No one took pride in it. It was another tool to be kept for when the day demanded. By the time the hook was reset ahead, the lane was a length longer, and the plan resumed. Toward evening, the edge of duty softened into the part of the day when hands could be counted and tools laid back in places set for them. The cutters wiped blades and checked teeth. The anchor team coiled down the heavy line in neat spirals, and the officer of the deck marked on the slate how far the ship had been moved. The messman passed word along that the galley had soup and biscuit ready, and the ship's business tilted toward the simple acts that made men steady for another turn tomorrow. A thread of steam lifted from the galley hatch and drifted across the waist, thin and straight in air that did not argue, and the sight of it put shoulders lower without a word. Small things filled minds, letters that waited somewhere, a bet over a game that had no coins in it, a cap that needed a new tape, but nothing that tried to tell the ice what it was. The boats were hoisted and covered, the saws went back to their racks, and the sledge that had carried the anchor was leaned against the bulwark. The ship lay in the notch that had been made for her, as if she had chosen it, and the mate took the last round before the watch changed. The slate showed honest progress. Night took hold without fuss, and the flow settled to a slower life, and the ship settled with it. Gear was lashed, the line to the anchor was slacked, and then brought up to a steady pull, and the last notes in the log were written without making more of the day than it had earned. A blanket of routine was pulled over the deck, the kind that keeps men from borrowing trouble before it is due. The feeling that remained under boot soles was a faint tremor that came and went as the hull found its ease in the pocket the party had carved. It said nothing by itself, yet it told enough about what lay close by and what held the ship safe for the hours ahead. A sentry stood at the bow and made himself part of the shape of the hours, and the watch below stretched out with their coats pulled higher. Questions were left for a morning that would bring the same tasks in a new order. The season had turned a corner without asking, and the ship had answered it. What waited now was the careful business of making a home where none wished to live, and that would be seen to in due course. Somewhere after, Clark closed the book and capped the inkwell. Chapter 4. Winter Quarters. Winter quarters settled in like a rule learned by heart, and the ships lay locked, with HMS Terror a short walk across the ridged floe. Housing went up over the upper deck, snow was thrown against the sides for warmth, and narrow lanes were cut to the gangway where watchmen made their rounds. The day ran by the board and by the bell rather than the sun, and everything depended on small habits kept without fail. Hammocks were aired, boots were rubbed, lamps were trimmed, and the petty officers moved through it all like clerks in a tidy shop. Pemmican was weighed ounce by ounce on a small scale, the tally marked in a neat hand, and no one quibbled because the figures were what kept the mind straight. A mess school formed in the gunroom, and letters were practiced line by line while a mate checked the slant of a stroke. The surgeon kept a calendar for exercise and ordered slow walks around the ice to keep blood and mood from sinking. Above, the covering canvas sagged here and there, and men took turns propping it with spare spars. The routine was plain, and it worked because it left little to chance or whim. The smell of tallow from dipped candles clung to the beams and marked the season as surely as a churchyard yew. The light came late and slid away early, so the hands worked by the glass rather than any bright mark in the sky. Morning musters under the head of the housing felt brief, then the day's tasks were divided, and the ship seemed more a village than a vessel. One party carried snow to bank higher around the hull, another patched a canvas seam, and a third tallied coal while a midshipman counted by twos. In the mess, the school kept on as if it were a craft learned at a bench, easy to sit within once the first shyness passed. An older quartermaster taught sums with patience that surprised the men, and a stoker copied words about birds he remembered from the north of England. A book passed hand to hand, and a story made quiet talk at supper without anyone trying to show off. The bell marked the turns, and the day moved in pieces, steady as a slow tide in a narrow creek. A faint ring of noon light showed at the skylight, like a coin set on a table, and made time feel held in the palm. Food set the keel for the mood, and the cooks knew it. Pemmican came out in its measured share, dark and dense, and a cook's mate broke it with a spoon into a pot, while a biscuit was crushed between knuckles to thicken the hoosh. Tea stood beside, strong enough to feel like a tool rather than a treat, and sugar was cut fine to spread farther. No one watched another man's plate too hard. If a hand slipped a bit of biscuit to a mate who had worked a double stint at snow, It passed without comment. The log kept a neat note of stores, and a clerk traced each day's draw, as if drawing a small map of survival. On Sundays, the measure of comfort came from a piece of preserved fruit that reminded some of home without pulling the heart too far back. It became a science the men could trust, a habit that sat beside prayer and sleep. The taste of the hoosh left a coat of fat on the lips that felt at once plain and honest, and it told the crew the day had been fed as promised. Evenings offered a little stage to live in, and that helped the minds hold steady. A curtain was slung between stanchions, a length of canvas turned into a backdrop with a bit of charcoal, and the carpenter's mate cut a wooden mask that made laughs even before any line was spoken. A rough play made by the men took shape, with borrowed coats and a turned-up hat for a judge, and the jokes were gentler than dockside ones, as if the cold itself had tempered words. Some read aloud from a book, and there were contests of recitation that made the men sit straighter than any quarterdeck inspection. A fiddler from the foretop laid a tune over it all, and kept the room together. When a story reached a turn, and the hero walked out with a broom for a sword, shoulders eased and eyelids lifted without anyone forcing cheer, officers came and went, and a nod from one of them gave more warmth than any extra ration could have. The thin scrape of the fiddle bow cut a line through the room that the men followed like a path home. The surgeon and mates set small laws that counted more than anyone admitted aloud. Damp socks were forbidden in hammocks, and a seaman who had a mind to cut corners learned to string them near the stove on a line, set apart so they did not scorch. A man who came below with breath rising from his coat stood a spell at the hatch until the sheen went off, and no pipe or candle went unguarded near a bulkhead. Flannel shirts were kept mended, mittens were paired and checked, and a shaving rota turned up each man in turn, whether he fancied it or not. Card games were kept to clear hours, and no one sat too long with losses. A quiet understanding grew, order made warmth, and warmth made patience. Small punishments stayed small because everyone knew the ship was a narrow world, and grudges took up space that belonged to sleep. The rough nap of clean flannel against the wrists felt like a plain comfort won by rules rather than luck. Outside the housing, the world lay broad and strange, and the guards took a careful circuit between the hummocks and the ships. Lanterns marked the lane, and beyond them the ice stretched in a plain that might have been a field, if not for the wide, low humps that rose from it. Sled dogs in one corner of the line shifted and set their paws without much sound, and their breath made small clouds when a man passed with a nod. Sometimes a man from Terror came over and returned with some bit of talk, and two crews became one winter town under orders that fit both. The science men took notes on the sky and the compass, and a young hand held the slate as if it were a chart to steer by later. The discipline of work outside felt good to a body that had spent hours indoors learning letters and tying small knots. No one tried to be brave for show out there. The flow kept its own manners and expected simple respect. A green curtain of light hung wide across the sky and made the night look held by gentle hands. Stillness did not mean ease. A man's thoughts took to walking if the body did not, and there were days when a small word turned sharp without cause. The bosun's call and a set of duties helped, and so did the bounds the captain set between messes and jobs. Quarrels rose over a card or a borrowed knife, and fell again under a steady look from a petty officer who knew most of the men by their first mishaps. Diaries grew thicker, and the writing eased the press that a tight space gave the spirit. Letters were drafted to wives and sweethearts and to no one in particular, and were folded as if the paper itself carried a promise. At times the ice shifted and sent notice to the keel that this world moved whether liked or not, and men paused and listened without talk. In those moments the ship felt like a living thing, and the work of the day seemed to hold it fast the way a hand steadied a friend. A single long groan ran through the timbers and faded like a cured ache. Toward the turn of the season, attention turned to the road over the ice and the work that would draw men away from the hull. Plans for the sledge parties took shape at the table, and the officers spoke in plain words about loads and distances, while the crew learned the parts each would play. Rope was laid out, knots were checked, and spare shoes for the runners were shaped and set aside without fuss. The carpenter widened a hatch to ease the lift of stores, and the cook readied bags so one man could find in darkness what he needed by simple reach. A small flag was mended and tucked by the packet of charts, and the men looked at it longer than the things that felt more important. Practice went on the ice in short turns, never far and never fast, but enough to make hauling feel like a learned motion rather than a test sprung by fate. The hemp of the drag rope rasped in the palms and made the coming work feel close and real. The ship lay quiet behind as the line took the strain, and thoughts leaned forward toward the haul to come. Chapter 5. The Sledge Haul. The party moved out in an even file, each man set to a place on the drag ropes, the heavy sledge behind like a stubborn beast. The oak runners rode over hummocks and sank in hollows, and the knots on the traces were checked by habit learned through the winter. An officer walked ahead with a staff and paced the lead, while a comrade at the sledge tail kept the long tiller steady. It had been planned the night before, weights divided so no one piece could crush a day, and the spare boots and tools were wrapped against damp. A flag on a short wand sat at the sledge head, a small claim over a very wide floor. Men rotated at the bow position, where the pull felt sharpest, then fell back to an easier part of the rope. The team said little, and labor took up the talk that might have filled the hours. A few steps, a pause to gather, then a longer heave, and the sledge inched on, as if persuaded by patience more than force. The wind pressed cold through scarves and mittens. A steady hand laid against cheek and brow as the rope tightened. The drill showed in the order. The foregoer marked a line that swept between ridges of old drift and bent around the worst crusts, and his raised hand meant a short set or a fresh bite with the boots to gain the next crest. Traces were kept tight. The slack feared more than a load, because slack snapped a man back and wasted a day's strength. The steersman at the stern watched the sledge's head, eased the tiller when the nose started to slewing, and called for a brace when the runners threatened to dive. The officer's notes rode in a tin case near the lashings to be marked at halts and set against the compass when the camp rose. A spare man walked without a rope and shifted to help where the pull knotted most, then fell back to rub a wrist or straighten a strap. No one argued with the line because the line kept time and place in a land that moved even when it held still. The harness leather gave a slow rhythmic creak that matched the work like a clock without hands. They halted by the hour in a small ritual that had been taught on deck before Frost owned the days. Packs were shrugged off and propped against the sledge, and a kettle was set under a shield to save fuel. The officer drew a board from the lashings and jotted the distance by pace and the day's heading by the needle, while a messman counted ration lumps for the short meal. A man checked the lashings with bare fingers, then pulled on his mitts quick and tucked that memory away for later when future loads might grow. Another pair untied the tent bundle just far enough to pull out a repair kit and fix a torn cover that had started to fray. The talk passed in short lines about home ports and promises made at quay and kitchen table, not heavy and not light, but in between. The length of the halts was almost never wrong, because the work punished stray minutes taken or given. Steam from the little kettle carried a faint leaf and tin smell that belonged to tea more than to the ice. Later in the day, the smooth stretches quit, and the trail broke at a narrow lead, its edge laid like a crack that had not mended. The foregoer tested the pane with his staff and pointed to a better place where the span narrowed. The officer set the order with practiced care. First, the load was unlashed and the gear nearest the top was carried across in hands and on backs, each man moving with space left between in case the sheet failed. The sledge was turned into a lighter thing by patience, not haste. Then a line was taken over and made fast to the far side. 2 men crossed again with planks cut from spare staves and showed where steps might sit. The steersman took the stern and gave the signal, and the party hauled in one long set, all weight on, and the sledge slid over the narrow place like a slow fish. No man ran, because running spoiled the rule of weight and distance learned since first Frost. The dark band of water showed through in places like ink laid under glass, a quiet warning that needed no more words. Past the lead, the surface rose into sastrugi that tilted the sledge left and right, as if to shake loose the rope team. Men swapped positions more often. The ones at the bow brought back after a few hard pulls, and the steersman planted his heels and held the tiller against the twists. At a ridge, the party cut a small ramp with short shovels, then hauled to set the nose up and over without spilling the top load. When the sled stuck, they used the old trick of a relay haul. Half the crew tugged the load to a mark, the other half carried kit to the new place, and then all hands returned for what remained. The day thinned, and nothing in the world seemed to live but the line of rope and the steady purpose that ran along it. They laced faces in scarves and kept sleeves tucked, and labor sowed the course ahead. A skiff of fine snow lifted with the gusts and tapped the back of bare wrists like a handful of sand against skin. Camp rose when the hour told, because a late hand doomed the next march. The tent poles were set. A wall of packed snow went up to break the sweep, and bedding was unrolled to trap what little warmth the canvas would hold. A stove was lit and watched close, and boots were set where they would dry by rule and not by wish. Repairs were done before hunger took command, and only then did the messman bring out the day's share. A slab of pemmican was divided with care, and a few ship's biscuits were handed around, the drill making a fair table out of a frozen floor. The talk stayed on plain things, how the boot rubbed, how the lashings sat, how the trail looked backward more honest than it looked ahead. A man rubbed his calf, and another rubbed a shoulder, and both said nothing of it. The ration's taste had a solid heft of fat and meat that clung to the mouth and promised work could still be done tomorrow. Night set in with the same steady step as the day, and the tent held the small world tight. Gear was mended while a comrade read a short page from an old book. The words passed along like a friendly hand from the past. The officer made the last notes for the log and tucked the case by his side, feeling for it once as if to count a coin. Socks were changed and wrung to keep feet honest, and an extra scarf was spread under a neck to ease a stiff place. There were murmurs about the path taken and the one to come, but no one tried to guess too far, because guessing made the march longer in the head. A man stepped out to look at the line of the snow wall, and came back with frost caught in his brows like stray dust. The candle burned low and steady over the mess lid that served as a table, and the warm, heavy smell of tallow gathered under the canvas like a familiar blanket. Before sleep, the steersman crawled out again to check the lashings and made sure the tiller sat true, because one loose thing could turn morning into needless repair. The officer set the watch in case of drift or a stray bear, though none had troubled the camp since the start of the season. In the dark, a man in the corner touched a charm from home and tucked it back, and another folded a letter half finished and slid it into a Bible cover. The sledge flag lay near the door, rolled and ready for the morning, when it would mark the line again. The logboard dried beside it, and the pencil was wrapped in cloth to keep it from cracking. Gloves were set at the foot of each sleeper, and boots stood where the hand would find them without thought. Outside, the world held still in a way it did not at sea, and even the thought of waves felt far. A thin band of aurora arced beyond the wall, a pale sign that hung without hurry over the camp. Chapter 6. Lessons on the Ice. By the shore of an ice-bound inlet, a small party left the sledge trail and came upon an encampment shaped by snow and patience. The men of that place greeted with open palms and calm manner, and an older pair, faces lined by years, motioned toward an igloo doorway cut from a drift. The party set aside formality and went in low, hats brushed clean out of habit, and a circle formed without fuss. Biscuits were brought out of a canvas bag, wrapped in a spare shirt to keep crumbs, and a bundle of steel needles were unrolled from a strip of cloth like small promises. The elders passed them from hand to hand, and one of the women smiled without hurry and produced a coil of rawhide for tying, and a few simple words of direction traced in the air. Over time, the room took on the ease of a galley mess, with names traded slowly and mistakes made kindly. A boy showed a snow knife and lifted the blade, then pointed to a curve in the ceiling, and hands told the rest. In that dome, the smell of seal oil hung low like a reminder of the food and light that kept families together. The talk settled upon where the wind carved the floes, how to cross a seam that had new skin, and which headlands gave shelter. It was not a lecture. It was supper chatter, turned to maps, and patience doing the work of language. The boy who had showed the blade crouched by a bank and cut blocks while the elders watched and corrected by touch on his shoulders. The snow knife was long, with a broad edge and enough weight to keep a line true, and the first block came out like a brick from a kiln. The blocks were set in a ring and leaned together on a slope that rose in a simple spiral. Each new piece widened the circle and closed the roof, and the joints were packed with loose snow so neatly that wind could not find a path. The lesson was that the snow itself gave strength when shaped to its own rules, and a home could be made from the thing most men feared. The entrance was set low, and a second wall inside slowed air, and a window of thin ice could be fitted if travel kept one from a store of hides. The knife's edge scraped across crust and made a dry rasp that carried into the sky and told how firm the bank was before a block broke free. When the capstone went in place, the older man pressed his palm against it and nodded, then set the knife into your hands for the cut to be copied and the weight carried. It took less than an hour to make shelter that turned wind into an ally, and the party paid attention like midshipmen before a compass. They taught more than building. A hand flattened over snow to show where the wind had laid stripes at an angle, and a mitten drew an arrow toward the way home would be found by line and shape rather than by the surety of charts. A ridge of pressure was not just a barrier but a bridge in places, and a thin skin across a lead could be read by the grain on its face and the way it took a step. The elders spoke of young ice that would bend, and of older ice that would carry sledges and men, and of how the land itself kept marks across seasons if men learned to keep the small clues. One elder scraped a hole with a scoop and showed a seam of deep blue within the drift that came from stacked seasons, and heads leaned close for that sight like pupils at a school bench. The line of travel, they said by signs, should keep to the lee of larger slabs, and tents could sit behind them when wind set hard from one quarter over many days. Short routes across open sheets should be taken at a steady pace without leaps, and poles should go first. The world that had looked like one blank field became a page with marks anyone could read if taught slow enough to care. The boy laughed when a clumsy step sank in a pocket, and the scolding came mild and fair. Travel itself followed rules that seemed humble and proved wise. Files were kept single when ground was uncertain, so weight did not spread where a crack might run, and each person watched the ankles ahead to measure rhythm. A long pole went before the leader, set down at an angle, and pushed in once, then a second time, and only then did the boot go forward. Spacing stayed even, with calls passed back by gesture more than speech, and the sledge followed behind with curves taken wide to keep the runners from biting. When a harness of dogs pulled, there was no whipping, only a hand on the reins at the front to guide a turn without scramble. Boots were scraped clean with a stick at halts to keep ice from packing in layers that could twist a knee. The grain of the pole's wood pressed under mittens with every test, a reminder that the tool was simple and true when used the way a teacher showed. If a lead lay ahead, the party skirted downwind of its edge so that any break would not spread beneath the line. If a ridge blocked the way, a path was cut low to keep the pull steady. Nothing was flashy. It was a craft like any other, earned stroke by stroke. Trade made its own friendship, each gift turning into a lesson. The older woman, who had carried the rawhide coil, took a biscuit in exchange for a short bone needle with a fine eye, and she showed how sinew was split with a thumbnail and rolled until it made a thread strong enough for skin. A man with a scar at his mouth scratched a map into the snow with a stick, drawing a bay like a spoon and a chain of islands set across its mouth, and he pressed a pebble near one end to mark a store of meat left in the last moon. Names came slow, made up into sounds that could be said, and then said again until they stayed. You tried to ask about storms, and the elder's hand made a wave across the sky, and then a calm palm laid flat, meaning patience first. After a minute, the taste of flour and salt settled on the tongue like a reminder of mess time far from this place. Stories followed, some of great bears, some of men lost when they thought a shortcut was clever, and some of spirits that were more warning than belief. It mattered less what was true than what kept a party whole on a long day. In the end, what had been called savage lands turned out to be well understood by those who lived there, and ignorance was the only wild thing. That night, a shelter was made for the visitors beside the family's own, and another lesson continued without vanity. Blocks that had been cut in daylight became a dome, a tunnel mouth kept low, and a small hole left near the top let air pass, and kept breath from thickening inside. A platform of snow was raised for sleeping, and reindeer skins were laid out with care, and a line was stretched high to hang mittens and socks so they would dry by morning. A lamp carved from stone was filled with rendered oil, a strip of moss trimmed into a wick and set along the rim, and it burned with steady purpose. A faint hiss from the lamp marked the hours without the need to count, and heads turned from time to time to trim the wick with a pin and keep the wick even. An elder spoke of winter journeys when sons were born under roofs like these, and the sailors answered with ships that had carried them across all oceans, only to pause here and learn like boys again. Talk moved to the body, to gums that swelled and legs that grew heavy on long hauls, and the elders made plain that meat taken fresh did more good than any syrup from a cask. Names for aches were shared by gesture, and men nodded at the simple wisdom. When rest came, it arrived without fanfare, as if learning itself were a blanket. Days ran in a calm chain of show and try. The sledge was set on its side, and its joinery explained with the stick pointing to joints. Crosspieces lashed so they could flex and not split when a ridge had to be taken at an angle. Lashings were shown to be snug rather than tight, and a strip of bone protected rope from chafing where it crossed a corner. Runners were rubbed with fine soot and a smear of fat to keep them from dragging, and cracks were mended with a sliver of wood worked in and bound until the line ran true. A boy corrected a sailor's step, steering him toward a better stance at the drag rope, and no pride was stung. The team dogs were fed after work, not before, and water was given in little parts so bellies did not cramp, and the sledges were left nose to wind so morning starts went smooth. At pause, the men learned to sit away from the sledge to keep the runners from sagging, and the lesson was taken with the care of those who had repaired many a mast. Above the camp one evening, a long green band moved in slow curves across the sky and drifted from one horizon toward the other, like a river that did not need banks. The work below went on at the same pace as before, steady and without complaint. When the time came to part, there were no ceremonies. Only a few more gifts slipped from hand to hand, and a final showing of the route that would take the party back to the ship. The elder traced once more the line along the inlet and the notch in the coast where shelter would be found if fog came down, and he marked with his boot the place where a store could be made should men come this way again. A sailor left a clasp knife by the doorway, and the woman pressed dried meat into his palm in return, and she drew a circle around her husband and children with her finger as if to say, "Keep your own close." The small weight of the traded needles in your pocket pressed against the ribs with each swing of the arms, a steady reminder that guidance had been bought at a fair price. On the march back, talk fell to rations and to how much lime juice remained in the casks, and who on board had been slow to heal after the last strain. Notes were made in the small book that rode in an inner sleeve, and the page held a map of the inlet and a list of hints that would be passed to the mess table, one by one. When the masts of the ship came into view, the party walked a little straighter. The day had taught a way to endure, and the next would test that lesson. Chapter 7. Scurvy in the Ranks. You measured out lime juice by the gill and let each man tip it back beneath the surgeon's eye, then wrote the day's entry into the sick book in a hand that tried to look steady. The routine had settled into a dull march. Dawn call, ration issue, a word from the officer, and then labor broken by short spells of rest that did not heal much. Men grew quiet between orders, and the mates cut some tasks into smaller parts so that weaker hands could manage them without drawing notice. Arguments that once burned fast now flickered and went out, as if no one had the spare strength to keep them alive. The surgeon said the juice would do its work, though the captain had asked for patience and faith as well. Down in the mess, a comrade beside picked at biscuit with the corner of a knife and tried to chew with his molars. The words for the book were simple: gums spongy, legs stiff, temper low. The page took them all without protest, a good clerk if nothing else. The taste that lay in many mouths like a coin pressed flat on the tongue told the truth without saying a word. The signs showed first in small ways that could be seen by any hand with an eye for change. Cheeks hollowed a little, and lips went pale, and the color in the men's skin took on a washed look that did not match the life their talk still tried to carry. Old scars, once white and quiet, reddened around the edges, as if called back to duty. The boatswain paused more often on the ladders, and stood at the head of the lower deck, counting men with a gaze that held long and weighed heavy. The petty officers eased the pace of holystoning, and set lighter jobs to those whose legs shook on long spells at the capstan. A topman who had always grinned at a jest now kept his jaw closed to hide swollen gums, and a marine's trousers hung looser than they had in the autumn. On the sick list, the tally rose in neat lines that looked clean, even as the bodies behind them did not, and the bruises that came up on shins and thighs spread into soft, wide pools of purple, the size of a palm. The surgeon and his mate kept their kits close and their calm closer, and they held to the drill as if the drill itself were a remedy. The bottle of lime juice was brought up with care from its shelf. The cork worked free for the morning measure, and the surge of spirit from the mouth of it stung the nose the way a fire can bite without flame. He asked for water warmed in small tins and a little sugar when it could be spared, and he had men sit in a loose row so he could watch each throat work the swallow. Talk of cause was kept quiet, though a word passed that the juice might be old or the mixing off, and some swore by fresh meat when it could be taken. The mess cook softened biscuit in a pan and made a thin stew when possible, and the men waited for the hour when the surgeon walked the deck again to see who could return to work, who could rest, and who should be added to the list. The routine gave a shape to the day, a scaffold when strength did not supply one. Orders still came, and work still met them, only slower and closer to the rails where a man could lean if need be. Watches were shortened by a quarter hour at the change, and those on duty were paired so that a steadier arm could carry the weight for a weaker one without words. The officer ahead stood at the gangway and gave signals with his hand rather than his voice when the men were bent to hauling, so the line did not fray. Deck drill was kept to the basics, knots practiced at the mess tables, slings checked twice, and the sledges set in order in case travel over the ice became need again. A short parade of muskets was held and then dismissed without fuss, when the ranks showed a sway that no sergeant liked. A man's cough could be heard from one end of the lower deck to the other at times, a dry tap that carried along the beams like a knuckle rapping wood, and the mates looked up each time without meaning to, counting in their heads. The day's labor, such as it was, formed itself into small, careful squares that could be marched through without break. What meat could be had was taken and made to do its best work, and the cook tried new ways without complaint. A seal, when luck and skill put one on the ice near the floe edge, brought the whole mess forward in hope and quiet thanks, and a pair of birds taken with a single shot near the hummocks lightened mood more than they filled bellies. The surgeon said fresh was a medicine in its own right, and he cut thin pieces and sent them first to those with mouths too sore for biscuit. A sledge party that had learned from the elders in the previous season came back talking of how a small bit of liver could help more than its size suggested, and they shared the lesson as if passing a rope along a line. The jar of pemmican was moved to the front of the shelf and given out in little squares to be sucked rather than chewed, so the jaw would not bleed for it. When a man held a fresh strip between his teeth and let it melt, the simple taste of fat and salt felt like a door opening in a tight room that had not seen ease in weeks. Tempers, loosened by weakness and worry, were guided rather than checked, and the camp habits that had been learned in winter took a new place on shipboard. The captain had the men read aloud in the mess, a chapter each, so that one voice would carry the page and the rest could let the words pass through without effort. Cards were dealt in the corner, and stakes were kept to buttons and pieces of string, and the sergeant of marines sat where all could see him and gave small nods when noise rose and fell. A comrade beside carved a little toy from a spare bit of wood and passed it to a youngster with a grin that reached one side of his mouth only. A hymn, started by the carpenter in a tone so low it seemed to come from the planks, ran along the table and made a line of sound that steadied hands on cups and eased shoulders tight from worry. The surgeon sat with the purser afterward to tally ration notes, and the mate mended a glove while he listened, and the ordinary pace of small things did more good than any man cared to admit. The sick book grew thicker, and so did the letters that some asked to have written before sleep, to be sealed if they were never needed. The officer had the clerk copy out the day's names and marks with care, and the pages were dried and stacked so that nothing would be lost to damp. The words were the same ones most days: swollen gums, foul mouth, pain in limbs, but the space they took on the page felt heavier for it. Men were not left alone, and when a hammock was rigged for rest in the daytime, a hand stayed nearby to fetch tea or to lift a blanket. Sewn hammocks were rare still, but not unknown, and each time the work was done, it was done slow and clean. When the clerk paused to sharpen the pen and dipped again, the line he made on the paper shone thin and black for a breath under the lantern before it dried into the steady strokes of a ship's record that would outlast the watch itself. In that quiet, the idea of duty took on a plain shape that even a tired mind could hold. By the end of the dark season, the men had learned how to spend strength as if it were coin, and keep some back against the day. The surgeon still walked with his bottle, the captain still held the line of order, and the mates still showed men where to put hand and foot so nothing was wasted. The better days came when the cook made a pot that did not scrape empty at once, or when a bird was brought down, or when the weak were given place to sit near the warm iron and tell a story. The worst days came when a name was struck and a space opened on a bench or a mess, and the next morning was shorter by that measure. The ice outside the ship rose and fell with the turn of tide in a way that could be marked with a stick, and the floes shifted their edges like pieces on a board. There were whispers of movement, and the lookouts told the officers what they saw and did not see beyond the pressure ridges. Through it all, the wood around held its shape and its calm better than some men did. Chapter 8. Pressure on the hull. Pressure had come first as a tremor in the floe, then as a shove that made the deck quiver in a way all understood. Bars were shipped home, a ring of backs bent in a circle, and the capstan took the strain as the rope led forward into the white field beyond the bows. The first lieutenant paced and counted the turns, steady as a clock, while the boatswain set the rhythm with a frank tap of his hand on the nearest shoulder. At the bar beside the break of the deck, it fell to a pair of hands to lean and push, and it felt as if the ship itself leaned with them. The order was simple: draw her toward the cut space ahead, and ease the squeeze at the quarters. All that shifted in the mind was one small thought, that this was not a drill or a winter exercise, but the narrow space between holding and breaking. Names were not spoken much. There was only the circle, the rope, the steady strain, and the officer's measured stride. The thunder of ice rolled underfoot, a broad, deep sound that filled the boards and seemed to come up from below. Ropes were paid out and gathered again in a neat pattern, and men were sent in twos across the floe to bury an iron and make a fresh hold, while others stood by the boats. When the order came to clear papers, it moved from lip to lip with no fuss, logbooks and charts to the boat, and care with each page. The junior clerk hugged the small chest as if it were a child, and a marine stood near with his coat buttoned to the chin. Work had a tidy shape, deck gangs to bars, the carpenter's party to the beams, and a file of men ready to ease weight from the hull. There was talk of making room for the boilers, of moving salt meat and biscuit by the ton, but the pacing of it kept panic outside the rail. The sour, damp scent that rose from the planks had a way of reaching the nose, and it seemed fresher with each new wound in the wood they opened and trimmed. Below, the carpenter set his men to brace the frame where it might spring, laying stout shores against the ribs and taking measurements with a plain eye. It was narrow work, the sort that made a man think only of reach and leverage and the next inch of room. A line of men at the pump worked steady and slow, not for water yet, but to be ready when pressure made seams speak. A boy with a bundle of wedges stood still as a fence post until he was told, then passed one, another and another, as if parts of the ship were hungry for them. Overhead, footsteps ran in patterns long practiced, and a name shouted once at the hatch sent a pair of men up to join. Between each task, marks of chalk were made on ribs and deck, a ledger in white of what held and what needed help. The bite of rope into palms told the exact moment a new strain came on, the skin saying what the eye could not see. On the ice, the path to the boat had been marked with small sticks, and the watch captain pointed a file of men along it with the neat chest and the wrapped folios. The boat itself, the pinnace, stood ready on runners, with her oars lashed and a few blankets tucked to keep the papers from hard knocks. A marine stood mid-path to count hands going and coming, his face set firm, his mind on the weight of what he watched. It fell to one hand to take the tin case that held the day's fair copy, and it was carried in both arms as if a sleeping thing were inside. The ship looked higher on her bed for each load that left her, a trick of weight a man could not reckon but accepted as right. Bare talk was used as the load passed, dates, headings, names that would make sense to a clerk when the day was over. A pale band of light hung in the far sky, like a low arch that watched and did not speak, and men glanced once, then faced the path again. On deck, the circle at the bars had grown, and there were two to a bar at the word. The weight of it shared out to slow the knee and keep breath even. The task was ordered, 20 turns, shift, 20 more, then shift again, and while one ring stood, another ring crouched ready. At times the bow rose a fraction and eased the grip on the quarters, and an officer's hand went up, a sign to hold, then a nod to pull when the feel came right again. The deck did not slip nor tilt, not in any way that made men reach for a rail, but mass inside the hull changed in a way certain eyes knew. A cask line was started aft, slow and plain, and weight came out in steps, not in a rush that would spoil the balance. A few things harshened a man's mouth before he thought, and a bitten lip answered back the strain from inside. The metallic taste that spread on the tongue set the mind to the simple fact that the work was more than hard, and had a cost that could be counted later. Discipline had its own frame and did not need loud words to stay upright. The first lieutenant saw that the watches fed into one another like gears, and that no hand stood too long in one place where thought might wander. A steady line of names was marked on a slate at the break of the deck, with ticks beside each as bars were changed and cargo moved. The clerk came up to ask after the chest and was told it rested safe, and he nodded once and returned to his notes. It was a day for the old pattern of the service. No noise about fear, no talk of what-ifs, and every man sure of the part his section knew by heart. The doctor passed along, counting faces and the way shoulders went, his check quiet and full of habit. The sharp reek of lamp oil spread from the open scuttle where a light had been trimmed for working below, and it seemed to trace the path of duty down the ladder and back again. After the heaviest of it, the squeeze lessened as if some great hand had turned its grip a quarter and decided to wait. The officer of the deck had the bars stood by but not hauled, and the carpenter came up to say which braces held and which would be eased for the night. A check of the seams along the gangway showed no new work for the plugs, and a small crew went aft to look where the stern had been pressed. The men sent to the boat returned and stood for a time near the rail, ready to move more if it was wanted, and happy to be told to stand quiet. A pair of cooks shifted the small kettle to a safer spot, and a marine paced the ice edge in easy steps, not to guard against anything but to quiet his own breath. The true thing pressed on everyone now was not a story anyone might tell back home, but a simple count of shifts and inches, and the 1,000 measures of patience the place asked for. Frost traced fine white lines along the seams on the windward side, drawn in threads that marked where breath escaped and froze. When evening settled, the ship had risen enough that some weight hung free, boxes showing a finger's space under them, and the men who hefted them had to reset their backs to the new height. The chest with the neat pages lay now under a blanket in the boat well off to the side, and a sentry kept his slow steps near it. The day's list was checked, beams shored, weight shifted, a clear space made forward, lines secured and left where they could be laid hands on in the dark. There was talk, soft and brief, of what might follow if the ice came back stronger and did not care for the work done against it. It was not a boast or a plan laid out loud, only the quiet habit of men who knew their duty in the night as well as day. A small prayer or two were said without any show, and a man who had not spoken at all since morning found one sentence about home to say to a mate beside him. A slow, thin creak travelled through the timbers at that hour and kept on for a while. A sound like a chair moved in a quiet room and set back again. Chapter 9. The Long March. The march began when the floes eased enough to trust a line of men and one sledge. Loads had been paired to pemmican, a few tools, and the rolled sledge flag, with journals and charts lashed under canvas where a compass card could be checked without fuss. Snow goggles narrowed the world to a thin horizon, and steps were set to a steady count. Halt on 50, rest on 10, move again. The officer walked ahead with a pole and a sailor beside him, traced each order down the rope, and there was no ceremony, only duty and the small checks of straps and knots. A sledge harness was shifted from a man whose legs failed. Another took it with a nod and fell in at the rear. A comrade marked a cairn with 3 stones to point the way back to our last camp, and a list of names was tucked under a flap in case a gale scattered us. The glare of sun bit hard through the slits, so the white ahead seemed like a road chalked by a strict schoolmaster. Thoughts turned to what could be spared next if the ice grew worse, and to how long the biscuit would hold if the meat had to be cut finer. The ship felt very far, and the shore not close at all, yet the flag on the sledge still hinted at a path between them with its quiet roll. At the morning halt, hoosh was brewed and shared by the spoon, a thin boil of biscuit and pemmican that kept men upright and quiet. A pannikin of water was counted down between 4s, and the cook's mate kept the pot from scorching by constant scraping. The senior seaman told the younger hands how to mind their knees and how to stand to ease the pull, and no man lifted his back with a jerk. The officer set the day's marks on the chart and rubbed at the pencil with his sleeve, then tucked the map away again like a small secret. The percussion musket rode near the head of the sledge with a single pouch of fire caps, not for show, but for bear or seal, and it made each camp feel less like drift and more like plan. A quill was set to the sledge journal and the last mile count recorded, with a rough sketch of a ridge and the note of where a cairn had been laid. The taste of hoosh was flat and close to the tongue, more duty than pleasure. A man mended the lashings on his boot, and another dug his spare mitt from the canvas pocket. And there was a soft, ordinary order to the motions. The flag sat where it had been strapped, and the sledge, lightened again by some small waste cast aside, waited for the next pull. Navigation was kept plain when sky and ground blended into sameness. A pocket watch set the length of each pull, and the lead man kept a line by the angle of the sun against his pole, as if turning a lesson from the mess table out onto the ice. When cloud drifted in, a bearing was taken, and the sledge turned by degrees instead of guesses, and if a ridge rose across the course, a ramp was cut, and the team went over in order. Stern man pushing, second and third pulling, then the rest, then the heave to bring the runners up. A cairn was built at noon, and a note set under a stone, with the direction to the last camp and the next, and a plain mark was scraped on the rock to show it meant something to us. It grew clear that the old stories of a clean line to the west were not for this track, and that the ice had its own habits, none of them proud, all of them stubborn. The click of the pocket watch at each 50-minute mark felt like the only fair judge we had. A boy beside the sledge asked if the land ahead was a shore or a pile, and the officer only said we would know by evening. The rope across shoulders was taken up again, and the sledge eased into its groove. Morale was kept by simple order and speech. A song was tried and set down when breath failed, and instead men traded short stories from home, and a petty officer told a joke that had no end and still eased 3 pulls. A book went from hand to hand in halts until its paper turned thin, and a calendar was cut onto a spare plank so days had a shape. A man spoke softly of the meals at his mother's house, and another listed the names of rivers from the atlas that lay under the sledge canvas, and the naming made the miles feel counted. The chap next to the officer made a quiet grace at the evening boil, and no one argued. A half-ounce of biscuit was shaved from the ration and kept back for those who faltered midday, and the belt of the sledge was tightened to stop the start and stop that wore men down. The feel of the drag rope through mittens pressed a square line into the palm that stayed even after the halts. Those who were worst with the sickness were given the middle slots where the pull was straight, and the strongest took the front where the line could lurch. The flag was unrolled for a moment when a ridge fell away to a flat plain, and that glimpse of it seemed to push the team as much as any word could. Illness took on the weight of a second sledge, and the party learned to move with it without drama. Gums bled at the seams, and legs grew treacherous, and a tally of who could pull and who had to be walked was kept like a clock. The marches stretched across more halts when a man's breath ran thin, and the officer shifted the plan without making a speech of it. Every pound was argued in quiet, and every pound that could be spared was left under a stone with a note promised for return. There was a day when the boat was looked at, and then looked at again, and the fact of its iron and wood told everyone what the next choice would be. A trench was cut in snow for a comrade who did not rise, and stones were fetched without a word for a cairn to keep the place, and the sledge moved on because it had to. The sight of dark blotches on a man's skin seemed like ink spilled by a careless clerk. When the evening came and the lamp was lit, names were set in the journal with care, and the line of the track was drawn so no man's work went lost upon paper. The march was not brave or grand, but it held, and that was all there was to it. Help on the ice came by skill and by kindness. A small party of hunters was met near a pressure line, and there was careful patience in that meeting, one side waiting for the other to show intent. The officer laid the sledge flag across the load in plain sight, and the men stood easy with their hands where they could be seen, and then a sign for peace went back and forth that was older than any book. Trade was set to simple goods, a needle and a length of line and a tin for a strip of meat, and a direction shown with a hand and a nod. The elder among them touched the young sailor's shoulder and turned him toward a line of low land in the distance, and drew a curve for a bay where water might be kind in spring. The smell of fresh seal meat from their camp was full and rich, and brought a straight look to every face. An old man laughed when our snow goggles were shown, and he pointed to the way his own eyes were shaded by a strip of fur, and he made a line in the snow that warned of thin crust ahead. When we parted, the sledge flag was set upright again, and it seemed to stand higher. The track turned, not by hope but by counsel, and the compasses and notes agreed. The coast gave signs that could be read by anyone who knew to be steady with signs. A scatter of feathers, a drift of driftwood, and a little sand showed through a scab of snow, and they were entered in the journal as more than luck. A ridge of old ice lay broken like a wall taken down by careful hands, and a channel of black lead wound toward a point of rock that matched a drawing made weeks back. The team began to talk less and plan more, and the evening halts were set to repair and to ready light loads for a run along firmer ground. The officer looked to the weather without comment, and then set the next day's pull to bring us to that point by noon if nothing failed. It helped to think in small pieces: a point, a cairn, a drift, and then another point. The sound of distant surf on a gentler day reached along the ice, like a promise, with a measured step. A man rubbed his knees, and another checked the lashings twice, then checked them again, and no one scolded him for it. The sledge runners were waxed with a scrap of candle, and the flag was furled short to the headboard for a clean run. The last stretch to the headland was not a charge but a set of fair pulls with tidy halts. Journals were bundled tighter and wrapped in canvas that had been greased at the seams, and a little bag of stones from the ship was tied in as if weight could anchor memory. There was the thought of a whaler's mast among the ice in some future day, and of a lamp in a cabin where a man might sit and tell plain facts with his hands on a warm cup. Orders were spoken softly and taken without show, and the track was kept straight along the lay of the coast so any boat might see a line of men if it came. A small depot was laid behind a ridge for those who might follow, and a note was written with enough care to be read by strangers. The sledge flag was unrolled again, and a fresh knot was tied at its head, and even the sick stood taller for a little while when it shook free. The glow of the tent lamp at evening turned the canvas into a low, steady dome where words could be said without strain. There was talk then, quiet and short, of what would be told and to whom, and how names would be kept whole. In the morning the pull would begin again, and the point would come near, and the next page would be ready. Chapter 10: Return and Report. The boardroom had been quiet, and the table had been long enough to hold the paper stacks, the inkstands, and the open sledge journal that had been carried so far. Names had been read, ranks noted, and the order to begin had been given with a small nod from the middle chair. A clerk had set a pen ready, and a messenger had waited by the door with a folded note from the river stairs where a Greenland whaler had waited downriver for the tide. The small flag from the sledge had been folded once more and placed beside the journal, as tidy as the mess rules would have demanded at sea. It had felt no different than a ship's table, only the faces were land faces and the questions were land questions. The room had pressed for plain truth, and the held breath between questions had seemed as close to a quarterdeck as one could find ashore. The steam of tea rose steady from a blue and white cup near the chairman's hand. The tale had begun at Deptford and moved north by habit of a watchbill, with dates given, bearings recalled, and each turn of sail laid into the record. The forenoon watch had been sighted, the notes from the slate named, and the first view of loose ice set down as neatly as a signal in a hoist. When the senior captain had asked how such bearings had been kept in the cold, the answer had been simple enough. The sextant had been wrapped in flannel and warmed under a jacket until a mark could be taken, and it had been checked against the mate's reading before a line was laid on the chart. The mate's patience and the captain's method had been joined there, and the clerk's nib had kept pace without fuss. The tick of a clock on the mantel had counted each careful word. They had asked what had kept the men steady in the worst days, and the answer had not troubled the pen. Order, small tasks, and food that could be trusted. The handful of things that had never failed had been named one by one in the old ship's manner, with the canvas shelter, and the stove that never ran without a watch, and the meal that did not lie. Pemmican had done its job, hard as it was to want again after the first month, and it had kept work in the arms when tasks had stretched long. The old rules on rations had held firm and had been weighed with care, and that had mattered more than talk. The little tot of lime had been measured by the gill as ordered, and men had spoken less when they had chewed and swallowed. The taste of lime had sat on the tongue during that part of the telling. They had wished to know about the land folk met beyond the floes, and that had come out in a steady line as well. The paths across the hard snow had been learned one step at a time, with eyes kept on the wind marks and on the hollows that hid thin ice. A spare needle had traded for a hint about a safe place to camp, and a biscuit had made a hard smile soften into a nod that had meant the same thing men meant at sea. Now we understand one another. A shelter had been raised as shown. with blocks cut to a clean join and laid to a firm ring, and the stove had been kept low because the roof had taught its own kind of sense. It had not been a tale of marvels, only a steady craft learned from people who had kept it for generations. The smooth feel of a bone handle had been remembered in the palm while the words were set down. The board had not turned away from the dark parts, and neither had the men who had stood before them. The pressure had been spoken of as work, because that was how it had felt, and the leaving of the ship had been set in the straight line of duty, because that was how it had been ordered. The weights had been paired, the flag kept, the tools chosen for service rather than comfort, and the march had been made because the ice had demanded it. A register had been read when needed, with names that had stood duty and then had not stood again, and the pen had paused only long enough to see the clerk catch up. It had been proper to show that temper had not ruled, only the book and the word of senior men. The creak of the floorboards under boots had followed each pause as if it had been part of the record. Advice had been asked for at the end of the main account, and it had been given with the same plainness that the sea had taught. Less weight had been urged for future sledges, fewer comforts, more room for what could light and warm and cook, and stricter hours of rest between hauls. The need for steady routine had been set out again, with the messes kept small, the reading and drill kept even, and the sick book written tight and honest, so a captain could see trouble before a party failed. The men who had used the sledge lines had not been weaker for simple order, and that had been said without shame. The board had nodded, and the chairman had asked for a copy of the pages that showed the course in the late season. The smell of coal smoke from the grate had settled in the room, while the last notes were taken. There had been a moment to close the covers, and that had meant the end, for a time, of this long work. Orders had followed in a mild way, mostly about lodging and pay, and the small pieces of leave that made a man know he had come safe home. And then a folded packet had been handed back with the stamped seal that meant all was in the record. A mate from the wharf had waited in the passage with word that the Greenland vessel had her boat out and would cast off as soon as the tide allowed, if a passage downriver suited, and that had seemed as good a way as any to go. Old sea habits had returned with the thought of a deck underfoot and a wake behind. The low thrum of a tug's engine had come faint through the window glass. The walk down to the stairs had not taken long, and the bundle under the arm had not felt heavy anymore. Pay tickets had been folded, a letter from a messmate's people had been tucked in a pocket, and the little sledge flag had been kept safe between the covers of the journal, so it would not be shown carelessly. The mate on the whaler had shaken hands without many words, and a place at the rail had been found that looked aft toward the city rather than out to sea. A boy on the quay had waved at nothing in particular, just at the idea of a ship moving again, and that sight had been enough to settle the breath. The river had drawn the vessel along the same way a tide had drawn a ship countless times before, and the board's questions had already begun to seem part of another watch. The damp salt on the lips had been left to memory while the new wake spread behind, and so our journey with the polar explorers comes to an end. The ice drifts away, the lanterns grow dim, and the silence of the Arctic closes once more. Until our next voyage together, rest well, dream deep, and good night.